All right. G'day listeners and welcome again to the 3 Feet Radio Show. Today we're going to do a special edition, not necessarily on a netball like we usually do. We're going to be looking at mental health. And joining me in the studio today is my co-host, Luke Herbert. G'day, Luke.
G'day, Ben. And can you think of a time when this subject has been more relevant? Outside of particular regional experiences like earthquakes in the Greater Christchurch area that happened in the past decade, I can't think of anything.
No, I can't think of that at all, but it does certainly apply to sport. And joining us in the studio today is clinical psychologist in Dr. David Collins. G'day, Dr. Dave. How are you, mate?
Good, thank you, Ben. It's so nice to have or be here. And Luke, thank you so much for having me on your wonderful show.
Thanks very much, Dave, or Colo, but we'll get to that later on. We do know each other away from this show. First of all, could you tell us a bit about your background as a psychologist and your sporting history?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Ben. Be more than happy to. So, I've worked as a clinical psychologist now for many, many years. And I work predominantly with young people. So I run a private practice these days. And the private practice really focuses on people usually between the ages of about 8 and 25, which is what would kind of classify is adolescence now. Adolescence, the researchers would suggest that it goes all the way up to about 25. And previous to that, I've worked in public mental health and in hospitals and various other mental health related fields, and kind of really found myself settled into working with my wonderful clients in my private practice these days, and also working on my wellbeing program, which is called Brain Grow, which is across several states here in Australia, in several different schools.
What?
And in terms, sorry, Luke.
No, yeah. Apologies.
I think I forgot to answer the last bit of your question too, Ben. My apologies for that, which was just about sport, and you and I obviously know each other really well through sport, and I absolutely love sport. It's actually one of the reasons why I work. I think I work reasonably well with young people, is because a lot of the young people I work with love sport, whether it be netball or footy or basketball or whatever it may be. And like a lot of young kids growing up, and I grew up in a town that's quite a big town now, but was pretty much a country town. When I grew up, sport was the lifeblood, and playing basketball and cricket, and then eventually finding junior footy, and eventually going on to play lots of senior footy at the Rupertswood Footy Club, and was fortunate enough to captain that club, and we had lots of success with lots of wonderful people.
And just sort of following on from the success you've had in the sporting field, what can you tell us about the workshops you do in schools? Because I've noticed perhaps over the last decade that perhaps the mental health of younger people, you may call them kids if you choose to, that's a different topic, it's perhaps come under more focus than there was even back in the 90s when I was in primary school.
Yeah, absolutely, Luke. I think that it's an interesting one, whether or not there's more mental health issues happening at the moment, or whether or not we're just getting much better at recognizing them, and parents and young people are getting better at seeking treatment and help for them. But I think if you look at society now, it's, I see it as a lot more complicated and complex than when I was growing up. And, there's lots of different influences and pressures on young people, things like social media, and just exposure to so much more information than young people have ever been exposed to before. And we are absolutely seeing increasing rates of mood disorders and anxiety disorders amongst young people, who can be particularly vulnerable. And we also know that a lot of common mental health disorders, what we call high prevalence disorders like mood disorders, anxiety and depression, that they tend to onset in our younger years. So when we're young people, that's when we often see the first signs of those kind of mental health disorders, which can be a longer term issue if they're not picked up and treated effectively.
And Dave, you talk about social media and the influence. You just look at some of the really unfortunate stories of kids with self-harm and taking their lives, and that social media can be used for good, but for bad too. And unfortunately, it's something that, you and I are probably in a similar age bracket. And it wasn't really something we thought about much when we were going to school, was it?
Yeah, no, definitely not. Like, I mean, I think, man, mental health was, you'd heard, back in that day, you'd hear about depression, you'd hear about anxiety, but it wasn't really spoken about. And I think, there was absolutely still quite a lot of stigma associated with it. And, even look at the number of psychologists in Australia these days, compared to 20 years ago, there's just so many more psychologists and capacity to be treated by a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker or a counselor, whoever it might be that can help you. And if you look at schools are so much better geared for it these days. Often schools will have their own psychologist or counselor or social worker on staff, and kids are able to go, or young people are able to go and get that support. And social media, as you said, Ben, it's such a double-edged sword. And in so many ways, and there's lots of research on social media, and what the research would tend to suggest is that when you are on social media and you're just passively consuming social media, if you're just kind of scrolling through social media all the time, then that's usually associated with adverse or negative mental health outcomes. So you tend to feel worse as a result of that. But if you use social media to actively engage with your friends, direct messaging and these kind of things, that's actually can be associated with positive mental health outcomes, which makes a lot of sense because as human beings, our number one need is for connection. It's our number one, apart from being safe, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about COVID-19, but apart from being safe, our number one need, particularly for young people, is to feel connected. And young people, one of the key mediums they do with that now is social media. And I think as adults and as parents or whoever we might be, it's really important for us to understand that social media is not bad and it's not terrible and the sky's not falling, but instead it's actually a really critical medium. But there is a dark side to it, both in terms of the content we look at, but also in terms of the number of hours we spend on it as well.
I wasn't planning on asking this, so Ben can give me a frown if it's owed, but since you talked about this kind of upsides and downsides of social media, how then do you apply that to traditional media? And I'm talking about cable news, CNN or Fox News. I'm not picking on those two news networks, but you sort of get the cases of like mass shootings that have become more prevalent in our societies, unfortunately, and for better or worse, they get the 24/7 hour news coverage because we now have an hourly news cycle. It's not even 24 hours. So is there any tie-in of the psychological factors that people can experience between social media and what I will call traditional media?
Yeah, it's a great question, Luke. Yeah, I think, one of the pieces of advice that I've been giving to, my clients that I work with over this time of COVID-19 is, and I think I've seen this a lot, a lot of advice, and it's good advice, is to limit the amount of news that you consume over this time. And, it's really about quality news. So trying to find some objective news sources and understand, I talk to my young clients all about clickbait and these kind of things and how we need to be really careful with the news we consume. And particularly, again, if we're on the younger side, that it's a lot easier to be influenced. But also, for people who are adults too, that we can absolutely kind of feel more anxiety as a result of consuming too much media. And at the moment, you don't have to look too far to see, quite a lot of doom and gloom, either on social media or mainstream media as well.
You talk about that doom and gloom, Dave. I'm of the opinion myself that you should be saying what we should be saying. Our physical distancing, not social distancing, because when you think of social distancing in a literal sense, it has a very negative connotation to it. It basically suggests that you shouldn't really be talking to anyone or having any contact with anyone, because really what we are doing in COVID to ease this or to reduce the spread is physically distance, not socially distance.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that use of language. I think that's a really beautiful use of language. Yeah. And I think it's a credit to them in a lot of ways. I mean, I know you're talking about the social distancing, but I think during these times, messaging is really important. And how we frame our language. And there's a rich history of research on this, by the way, in terms of how we form messages to be the most influential and acceptable to people. And, there's academics who dedicate their entire career to this kind of thing. But it's a beautiful point you make, because there is absolutely a difference between physical distancing and social distancing. And while there is obviously an overlap, during lockdown, you can't go and hug your friends and, shaking hands and all these things, these traditional things we would do. It doesn't mean we have to be emotionally distant from our friends and our family and all the rest of it. And, what's really interesting is that if we look at what predicts happiness, and there's lots of things that do predict happiness, and how we measure happiness. I'm not talking about that kind of short-term buzz happiness, what we'd call hedonic happiness, but I'm talking that more sustained happiness, what the researchers call eudaimonic happiness, where we have a deep sense of connection and a sense of purpose in our lives. The biggest predictor of that is the quality of our social relationships. And if you look at what the research is, this amazing research study that's been running for about 80 years, and it started in the 1930s. And it started at one of the famous universities in Boston. And basically what they did is they got a bunch of kids who I think were about 5 at the time. And this is obviously pre-World War II. And they followed them up just about every single year of their life. And a lot of these men are still alive today. And they were looking at what predicted their happiness across their lifespan. And they looked at, how much they earned, what job they had, probably not this, but what kind of car they drove and these kind of things. And what they actually found is that the thing that predicted their health, so both their health and their happiness the best, was the quality of their relationships with people. And the simple reason for that is because relationships make us feel safe. And when we feel safe, then our stress response reduces and our willingness to go and approach the world increases, which allows our brain to feel a lot safer overall than what it would when we're disconnected. And to get to your point, Ben, that social distancing can make us feel less safe because we're disconnected from people, but it doesn't mean that we're emotionally distant, which is why, these Zoom chats and the text message when we reach out, or a socially distanced catch up on our front lawn, or whatever it might be with our neighbors, on the other nature strip, however we want to do it, those things are just fundamentally important to our well-being.
And just a side diversion here, but I think this is the right time for it, because I was going over your website, which I'll ask you about in a moment, or Ben will, before we finish up this chat. But you had a section of your website that deals with parenting teens. Now, I don't parent any teens, so I'm probably the least qualified person to ask this, but I found, if I can use the term logic you had interesting. You said basically, instead of reinforcing negative consequences, talk about the rewards of a teen's behavior. So can you explain that to us? Because to me, it strikes me as counterintuitive, at least.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a really relevant one, because I also, I'm a dad, and I watch my girls. They love their netball and they play netball, and I coach them in their girls' footy as well. So it's a highly relevant topic, for me as well, Luke. And what you're talking about is an interesting study where they look at something called hyper-rational thinking, and it's basically this idea that there's a myth, if you like, in society that young people are impulsive and young people never think about the consequences of their choices, which is actually not particularly true. What we know is that young people aren't always impulsive, but what we know is that young people have a tendency to value rewards more than the consequences. So they might actually see the consequence, but they might just value the rewards more. And as a result, you might see them make poorer choices at different times, or different choices at different times. Whereas adults, and this kind of gets back to the way the brain's developed, and an adult has slightly more connectivity in their brain between the kind of the more pleasure and emotional brain areas, and the smart brain areas, what we call our prefrontal cortex. And that connectivity or networking kind of happens as we get a little bit older and reach that kind of age of 18, 19, 20, all the way up to 25, which is why we might see young people kind of doing things that an adult would look at and go, what are you doing? I can't believe you've done that. But it's mainly because young people really value rewards. And really, Luke, it goes back to the way our brain evolved as people, that, ultimately, if young people didn't go out, get out of the cave and seek the rewards, then we wouldn't be here as a species. So they had to get out, take risks, and get that payoff. And that payoff could be, more fertile hunting lands or new friends or whatever it might be. But it's our capacity to be able to go out there and seek those rewards has been a huge part of our success as a species over many years, which would be a huge conversation to have, which is probably outside of the scope of this chat. But, I hope that gives some answer to your question.
And with your younger clients, Dave, obviously they love sport too. They obviously play junior sport. What have been some of the tips that you've given them to maintain focus and also maintain proficiency in their skills? That sort of thing. Because, you'd be a bit rusty if you haven't kicked the footy for a while, for example.
Yeah, it's a great point. I was having a chat to a friend of mine about that, Ben, and one of the things that he was saying, which I never really thought about, was that at the moment, obviously, elite sport isn't on. As a general rule, it's not on. I know a lot of the sports are planning on coming back, and I think that actually has a really profound impact on kids and young people, teenagers as well, obviously, and even people who are adults who are playing in our local sporting clubs, which again is, these local sporting clubs are just the lifeblood of our society and, the absolute spirit of our society, because they just give people so much, whether it be players or spectators or committee members or coaches or parents or whoever it might be. They're just so fundamentally important. And not seeing the elite athletes on television or going to the games, I actually think that's been a real tough aspect of of kids' motivation. It's hard to be motivated when you're not seeing your heroes on the netball court, or on the footy field, or on the basketball court, or on the rugby field, whatever it might be. So I think that's been really challenging. And, ultimately, I think it's just about setting realistic expectations for ourselves during this time, and knowing also that, our skills don't just evaporate overnight. Even over a period of a couple of months, if we don't practice it, sure, we're going to be a bit rusty, but the brain doesn't really work like that. The networks in our brain are a little bit more robust. So even the advice I always give the people I work with, and we definitely talk about this in Brain Grow as well, is that something is better than nothing. So doing something is always infinitely better than doing nothing, because the brain works on the use it or lose it principle. If you don't use it long enough, then eventually, and it's not after 2 months, but eventually you will, you will lose it. And I think the other part, for people is just the social nature of it, that once we are able to get back into a social context and be around our friends, our motivation to train and to train hard will probably go up. I think almost certainly go up with that. But that kind of highlights another point, which is what we call the reverse culture shock. So, this is the idea of coming back out of society, coming back out of lockdown. That can be a really tough challenge for people as well. And people can struggle with feelings of anxiety and alienation as a result of that. And there's a rich history of research on people, coming out of places like Antarctica after a 12-month scientific expedition, and just how hard that is for people. And we're all kind of part of that big experiment over the next few months.
And you talk about being sort of like cut off from the world and that kind of thing. One thing I've discovered during this time, I've got a new love of walking. I love going for a walk, Dave. Seriously, because I live here in Chapel Street, St Kilda, so I'm not far from the beach. I walk down to the beach, and seriously, walking along the beach, I usually do it with a walking buddy. But it is the best way to keep your mind clear. And I've had some of the most deep and thought-provoking conversations with someone while I've been doing it. Usually one wouldn't have that opportunity or wouldn't even think about doing it.
Yeah, I think that it's a wonderful point you make, and well done to you, Ben, for that. I think it's great because it's so easy to just want to bunker away in our cave. But movement is so important for our well-being and physical activity. And what physical activity does is it gets certain brain juices or brain chemicals going. One particular one called BDNF, which is like fertilizer for your brain cells, basically, and it helps to make new connections, but also maintain the health of our current connections. And as soon as you move, you start releasing more of that, and allows you more, as you said, more clarity of thought and more ideas coming out. And the other beautiful thing, and I think you've been doing a bit of this, Ben, following you along on social media, is you're kind of changing up the route in which you walk, and just trying little bits and pieces. And that's another beautiful little life hack, in that when you do something called, or when you do that, you create, not something called, but you create novelty. And novelty, our brain loves new stuff. Our brain loves learning new stuff. So even just walking down a different street than you normally walk down, our brain loves that because you're compelling it to learn. You're basically saying, hey, I haven't been down here before. So our brain says, hey, this is all this new information that I need to learn. And I need to kind of connect all these new connections together in my brain to learn this stuff. So you're actually basically compelling your brain to learn when you give it that novelty. So I'd say you are absolutely A+ with your COVID-19 lockdown strategies, Ben. Well done.
Thanks.
And just as a follow-up, because this ties nicely to the topic of exercise in a way, and again, I referred to your website where you had a useful video about taking small steps at a time. But how do people that are then reintegrating themselves into society, if you like, how do you do that as we kind of come out of lockdown? Because some people are genuinely scared, and it's perfectly understandable. I don't want this to come out the wrong way. I mean, I think everyone's been stressed to at least some degree.
Yeah, absolutely, Luke. I literally just wrote a blog on this, which you can see on the Brain Grow website, or you can check it out on Facebook as well, about how do we adjust post COVID-19 lockdown. And your point was a really important one, which is about little steps. Some people will be bounding out their front door ready to take on the world. There'll be a good portion of those people, but there'll also be a portion of people who are anxious and stuck in this paradox between wanting to go out and connect and engage with the world, but also being fearful of doing that. And that's the really unique thing I think about this COVID virus, is that at one level, we want to connect, but at another level, connection is, our anxiety will tell us connection's dangerous at some level as well. And, the spreadability of the virus kind of creates that, which is why these physical distancing measures have been really important. But I think that what it's about is for a lot of people, it's about little steps. And also, being aware of this. I think I was referring to it before about this reverse culture shock that can happen, where we kind of step outside and we can feel alienated from the world, and we can feel that we don't belong, or we can start to question even our friendships and kind of start to question, well, am I really friends with this person? But it's actually not that. It's just that we're just we haven't been used to connecting for a little while. And one of the pieces of advice that I was reading a little while ago now from one of the experts on this reverse culture shock idea is, not making big life choices, over the next few weeks while we come out of this, whether it be, choices about our friendships or other kind of big choices in our life. We need to be a bit careful with that, because we're still reintegrating and getting used to this new normal.
And we were talking off air before, Dave, you were saying today, for example, you had some clients on telehealth. Is that one of the main changes you've noticed as a result of COVID-19 to your industry? And do you think it's like it'll become something that you do all the time? Like it'll be a change for the better or for the worse?
Yeah, great question, Dan. I think that's been absolutely the major change for just about every health professional
Mm.
throughout the country. And I think all credit to the federal government for really stepping up and providing Australians with the opportunity to access their health providers. I mean, I think that's been a really big focus. And in terms of mental health, I think telehealth has been wonderful. And people adapt. We're so adaptable as people. People adapt really quickly. People are used to coming into my clinic and meeting me in the clinic, but it's amazing how people really adapt within 5 minutes. So long as the audio works and the video, and I'm sure everybody, all the listeners, have kind of been pointing to their earphones, and doing all those non-verbal things when the videos aren't working properly. We've all been there and done that over the last couple of months. But whether or not it's here to stay, it's a really good question. I hope it is. I hope that into the future for mental health professionals and health professionals in general, that we can have a bit of a combination of both, because there's some people who really enjoy the telehealth video conferencing, and then there's a good chunk of people who enjoy just being in there with another human being. And obviously for GPs and medical doctors, there's a lot of, physical examinations and that kind of thing that they need to do. So, there's obviously limits to telehealth for those kind of doctors. But for my work, it's a little bit different in that you can do the telehealth stuff. But I certainly would envisage a future where I can, hopefully in the not too distant future, get back into my clinic and be seeing my clients face to face, which is something that I love to do.
Just briefly, and this question's been floating around in my head since you mentioned reverse culture shock, and you don't have to give an extensive answer, it is slightly off topic, but in terms of that kind of culture shock, is that something perhaps the soldiers that came home from World War II experienced? They came back basically from overseas service X number of years back to some kind of normality, and it was basically a shock for them?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of, there's definitely research around those kind of things. Not entirely familiar with it, but and particularly soldiers who came back with what they would have called shell shock back then, which is now what we call PTSD. But yeah, there's certainly a rich history of that, Luke. And I think what's interesting about COVID-19 is that there's kind of like 8 billion of us in the same boat at the moment, where we're all kind of in this together. And I think that mentality can actually be so helpful and so important, that there's a shared struggle that we all have. I think one of the risks, and I was listening to or reading something from the esteemed psychiatrist, Professor Patrick McGorry, who was sort of saying that he believes, and his idea and what he's read is that we're at risk of having this second wave, not necessarily of coronavirus, but this kind of second wave of mental health concerns that can happen in the months and years into the future as people's lives post lockdown take different trajectories. And some people's lives will recover really quickly. Other people's lives and their livelihoods and their jobs and their relationships might recover more slowly, and there might be parts that don't recover. And as a result of that, I think that, as a country, we need to be ready for that battle from a mental health perspective, because I think there'll be people who don't recover in the same way as others. I think that hopefully answers your question, Luke.
And just one last follow-up on that, Dave. You talk about people being bounding out of their house, and then sometimes people being scared to do that when everything's all open up again. One thing I think that's been really good of late, although they were a bit slow to do it, was talking about funding for mental health. But at the same time, too, it'll be interesting to see how, if the suicide rate will go up or go down. I mean, I don't like talking about suicide in a negative perspective, but it's going to be something that's going to be really important.
Yeah, definitely. And there's definitely been some media around that and some commentary around that. And you know, I think it's a really,
Mm.
it's a really important conversation. And I think it gets back again to what I was saying before about what predicts well-being and what predicts mental health, which is about connection. And that's why it's so important for all of us to reach out, and all of us to check in with the people in our lives, and to make sure that not just post lockdown, but we continue to do that over the, you know, not just the coming months, but the coming years. And I hope that's something we can take away from this coronavirus. You know, I don't think, you know, it's hard to kind of argue that, you know, it's hard to find the good things, but I definitely think that, you know, that can be something that can come out of it, which is, you know, a real awareness of just how important our well-being and our mental health is, and what role we have in everyone else's mental health in our lives. What we do and how we treat people can have just such a profound impact. Even if you don't know, even if you haven't recognized it, you might not know the impact you have on somebody. That text message, that phone call, they might not even tell you, but that impact can be profound and life-changing, and life-saving sometimes.
And again, just briefly, but just for some clarification to the viewer and my own understanding, is some of the mental health effects of the pandemic, is it basically in essence delayed? In other words, people, they feel good for a time after we start to come out of lockdown, and then the stresses, whether it be financial, unemployment, what the stresses may be, it then hits them further down the track. That kind of thing can happen after natural disasters. You sort of have a period of, oh crap, it's happened. Great, we get to rebuild, we get new stuff, and then everything just comes in it's like a landslide.
Yeah, absolutely, Luke. And yeah, that's precisely what I'm saying. And again, there's definitely research on that around survivors of disaster, and you know, obviously, knowing that you're down there in the beautiful South Island of New Zealand, you know, Christchurch obviously went through, you know, approximately 10 years ago or so, went through some enormous disasters. And you know, there was lots of research on those people, and how they coped, and sometimes how they struggled. So yeah, absolutely, we need to be aware that it's not just this immediate thing, but it's the longer term, or at least medium term effects that these crises and disasters can have on us.
What is it, Dave, that makes you so passionate about working with younger people and their mental health?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah.
I think I learned so much from young people, Ben. You know, I often say to the people I work with that I learn as much from you as you learn from me. And it's this, you know, I think sometimes young people are a bit misunderstood, and we can have this stereotype of them of, you know, all they're interested in is their PS4 and their Instagram account and their Snapchat streaks. You know, and it's just such a misrepresentation of young people. Young people are incredible. They're amazing. They've got such a capacity to connect, for empathy, for innovation. And I continue to be inspired by the young people I work with, you know, both in my practice, but, you know, also at Brain Grow. And, you know, the thing that probably got me into it initially was just recognizing the amazing opportunity that young people have, but also the vulnerability that they have as well. And that really gets back to the way their brain develops. So, you know, in these younger years, and I'm talking people in their 20s here as well, like they're absolutely in this conversation, that their brain is incredibly what the neuroscientists would call plastic or neuroplastic. So it's really capable of positive changes, but negative events and traumas and other things like that, and trauma can come in many different forms, that can have a really profound impact on a young person's brain, and potentially a bigger impact than what it can have on an adult's brain who is more developed. So within the young person's brain is both amazing opportunity, but also great vulnerability. And in that way, you know, I'm inspired every day to help them enhance those abilities and opportunities and strengths, and also help to protect from the vulnerabilities as well.
Put another way, and this is kind of, I'll draw my own experiences from the earthquakes up in the Greater Christchurch area, and I lived up that way, and I was in my mid-20s at the time, basically. Do you think then there are learning opportunities from people that are in difficult times, both for either yourself or the people in question? I mean, one of the strangest things I found out of the earthquakes, not to hijack the discussion, was, and I won't go into the details, but I learned different things that I wouldn't have learned otherwise, whether it be about myself, things that were practical to do with leadership of organizations. There was a whole range of things that if you told me that you could learn that from a natural disaster in advance, I would have looked at you like you're a kook. No disrespect to you, but I just wouldn't have believed it.
I love it. I love it, Luke. Yeah, and you can do that without trying to say, hey, you know, like while at the same time having a deep respect and care and empathy for the tragedy that's unfolded and the catastrophes that are unfolded. And I think that, you know, that's absolutely the starting point, that while these things are you know, incredibly, in the case of Christchurch, obviously catastrophic, that we can actually reflect on ourselves, whether it be individually or our national identity or our collective identity, and start to draw strength and start to draw, you know, conclusions about who we are and what we can take from it, which would be right at the heart of resilience and finding a resilient approach. But that's not always an easy pathway, and you know, it's not easy just to bounce straight back, and you know, the brain doesn't quite work as simply as that. And you know, for some people, you know, it's a longer road back because it impacts them on a deeper level. But to pick up your point, Luke, I'd always really encourage people to reflect on what they've taken out of this, what they've learned about themselves, what they've learned about others. And I think that's a really lovely time now as we start coming out of lockdown to do that. So yeah, I 100% agree.
And listeners, one thing that not all of you would know is that Dave and I have known each other on and off over the years quite a bit, specifically through Rupert's Wood Football Club. Now, Dave, or Colo, as we affectionately did call you back in those days, and a lot of people do, what are some of your memories of us being mates through footy? I mean, it was an amazing time back in those early to mid 2000s down at the Shark Tank, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Ben. I was thinking, you know, I often reflect on my time in football and sport in general, and you know, you meet some of the best people in your life through sport, and I think that's why, you know, sport's just so important. And Ben, my memories of you is certainly, you know, absolutely one of the best people I've met in football. And what I'd say is, you know, that you were always universally loved and universally respected by people, and you know, this really wonderful blend of steadfast professionalism, but real friendly humanness at the same time. And you know, yeah, just very, very fond memories of that, and you know, meeting just so many wonderful people in sport over the years, and now, you know, as now I've retired and doing kind of, you know, coaching and that kind of thing in junior sport, you know, I've had a very similar experience. Sport, as I said, I think I'm repeating myself here, but it's really the lifeblood for so many people in our community, and something that we all get so much from.
And I think if I wouldn't have been in that supportive environment all those years ago, I wouldn't be where I am today. I'm still involved in state league competition. I'm on hold at the moment, but I'm working at the AFL now, and being involved back then, certainly because it was so supportive, gave a sort of a confidence in myself to be able to say, yeah, I can do this. I can do it. I can be involved, even if it's off the field. And I love my job working for the league, for the umpiring department.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And it really gets back to that point about social support and the quality of our connections. It catapults us, it projects us, it gives us confidence, and it gives us belief in our ability. And as you said there, Ben, you know, it's projected. Oh, sorry, it's catapulted you in your career, which I always follow closely.
Thanks very much for joining us today, Dave. We really appreciate it, and good to have a different guest other than someone netball related today, wasn't it, Luke?
It was absolutely fantastic, Ben, and Thank you for joining us, David, and thank you for the insights that have never been more relevant to our global situation.
It's my absolute pleasure, Ben and Luke. Thank you so much for having me. And anything that helps us at this point in time, I'm always happy to be involved with. And thank you for your wonderful questions, which were really on point.